Hello and welcome to our first online lecture. The idea is to keep these kind of short. We'll do them in chunks, so 15-20 minutes for each one. You should be able to watch them at your convenience, review them, go over them. Again, if you have any issues, technological issues, understanding the material, please reach out to me. You can do that via email. I'll make myself available and in front of the computer during my regular office hours. You can also reach out to me at other times also. It looks like they're restricting travel to campus a little more severely. I'll also schedule a Zoom meeting for a couple hours before we get to our next exam, but that's still a ways off. So the subject of this first online lecture is adaptive landscapes, but to do that we need to understand just a couple of key concepts. So even if you've only had a very little bit of genetics, like in introductory biology, you know that it can get very complicated. Even the genetics that Mendel described and defined is somewhat complex, but it gets way more complex than that. We're going to simplify it for you. We're just going to understand the bare basics. So quantitative genetics is trying to put a number on how much different alleles, different genetic situations contribute to a certain phenotype. And if we're going to talk about evolution, then we need to understand the evolutionary impact of those different phenotypes. Now, phenotype is not only controlled by genetics, it's also controlled by the environment. This equation down here, you don't need to memorize it. It's just a little bit more of a mathematical way to represent this top part. So the way that you look and behave is determined by both your genetics and your environment. For some traits, it's mostly genetics. For other traits, it's mostly environment. So as an example, your eye color is primarily determined by your DNA, the genes that you receive, alleles that you receive from your parents. But environment in extreme situations may play a role. If there was some sort of developmental problem early on or chemical exposure, you might have some modification of that phenotype. On the other hand, your food preference or the language that you speak is primarily environment. Maybe with food preference there's a little bit of genetics playing a role, maybe more so than the language you speak. But the type of language you speak is controlled primarily by your environment, with only a little bit of the genotype going into that. So we are interested when we look at any trait in heritability. And heritability is simply trying to figure out how much of that phenotype comes from your genes, how much of it is inherited from your parents, and how much is determined by your environment. And for some things this is pretty tricky to figure out. And so we have a number of ways that we can do this. We're only going to really look at two here briefly. One really important one in humans is twin studies, because we have some limitations on what we can do when we're doing these types of studies ethically, reasonably, time-wise, logistically what we can do. And twin studies sometimes set themselves up as natural laboratories. So genetically identical twins or monozygotic twins share the exact same genome. So if they are raised in different environments, then any similarities that we see must harken back to the genes that they have. And so although, again, we don't do this for ethical reasons, we don't take two babies that are identical twins and separate them and send them off to different places so that we can study them, but sometimes that happens naturally. And so scientists have identified individuals that were adopted to different families and so raised in quite different environments. And sometimes the amount of similarities is surprising, even in things that we might think were primarily environmentally caused, like what do you choose to do for a living? There's been shown to be some correlation in these individuals raised in very different environments that they tended to choose similar jobs. And so maybe your choice of a profession is a little bit more down to your genes than your environment, although environment certainly plays a major role. So these twin studies are just one way that we can begin to get at this issue of heritability. We can also look in large populations where we have large enough sample sizes to filter out some of the variety and diversity in the populations. So if we take two large populations with maybe unknown genetic backgrounds, but if they're large enough, we have a good chance of capturing most of the genetic diversity of populations. And so if they are raised in different environments, this is kind of the opposite of a twin study, right? Lots of genetic variation, but then similar environments. So if they're raised in similar environments, but in different environments, right? With also different genetics, And so in that case, then we could maybe begin to determine what environment is causing with a very similar genetic background. But these are tricky and sometimes need to be studied for years and years and years, or we need really, really large sample sizes. So how does evolution come into this? Well, let's look at a fairly simple example. So here we have two populations that start out genetically identical. So these are corn populations, and this is a controlled experiment where we modify the force of selection. This would be called artificial selection because humans are doing the deciding. Okay? And so what they did is they started with two identical populations. They took them from the same pool of seeds, and then they did these selection processes where, one, they only let the highest producing oil kernels be the founding generation for the next cycle. And so they would say take 5% of the corn kernels from a population that had the highest oil, and they would plant them. And then for this blue population, they took the 5% that had the lowest oil content, and they did that year after year, generation after generation. And so notice that over nearly 100 years of this natural selection experiment, they were able to continuously, and even this is even extended into today, they're still able to continuously increase the amount of oil. And they've also done the same thing. And notice it's a little bit of a flat line here because they've gotten near zero oil content when they tried to go the other way. So you can see down here, we're still not quite at zero, but between 1 and 2% in this population, and upwards of between 20 and 24% for the population in which the natural selection was pushed the other way. So this brings a couple of key factors too that you need to focus on. Number one is that this is primarily a genetic trait, right? The amount of oil might be determined by environment, and there certainly may be a component of environment, but genes seem to play a major role, and we can demonstrate that because we have driven these different oil populations to the extreme. Okay. Now, number two, the second thing that you need to know is that the amount of genetic diversity here is incredible. Even after 100 years, we haven't completely fixed a trait. And this is important to remember. And the reason this is because it's a very complex trait controlled by many different genes. That's called polygenic, right? And each of those genes might have multiple alleles. There's probably an environmental component here. And so what that means is we can select and select and select without completely eliminating genetic diversity. And so this is one reason why genetic diversity may remain high. And so we call this, I'm going to skip ahead here just a bit and we'll come right back. We call this latent variation. So latent variation is variation that may not be immediately apparent as soon as we look at a population. It might be hidden in complex genetics and polygenics. It might be multiple loci. There might be pleiotropy hiding it or epistasis. You don't need to know definitions for any of these, but you may have come across them in other classes. We did learn pleiotropy, right? You should know polygeny. So all of these things make these traits very, very complex. So let's introduce the idea of an adaptive landscape. To do this, I'm just going to review a very simple graphing process, and you should be very familiar with this. Some people have a little bit of trouble with graphs, so let's just review. So on this graph, I've got an x-axis, right? If we were doing an experiment, this would be the variable that we were changing, and then we would look for a response and map that along this y-axis. So here, although this may not be something that we can directly change, phenotype, we could take all the individuals in a population, and so, for instance, imagine this was birth weight in humans, where most individuals fall in the middle, and we have fitness on the y component. So not only do most individuals fall in the middle, but those individuals do the best. And we tend to see these normal distribution curves in phenotypic traits that have adapted to a stable environment. And so individuals at one extreme, if they are really, really large when they're born, they would not do very well. They would have low fitness. Individuals at the other extreme, maybe if you're very small when you're born, you wouldn't be doing very well. And so in stable environments, we tend to cluster and have the highest fitness level around the optimal birth weight in this example, but it could be any trait. So when you see a normal curve like this in numbers or even in fitness levels, this represents fairly stable environment with natural selection kind of focusing in and getting the population to be close, although with some diversity on either side, but to be close to what the maximum fitness is. Okay? So all of these things can play a complicating role. But now let's take that two-dimensional graph where we had one trait on the x-axis, and let's turn it into a three-dimensional graph. And this three-dimensional graph is called an adaptive landscape. So here we go. We're going to take two traits. In the example in the book, they take the length of the leaf. They call it petiole length, leaf plus the petiole, which is the stem of the leaf. And then they take the flower length, which is the inflorescence plus the peduncle. The stem of the flower is called the peduncle. So we take those two things and we can put every individual in a population based on their average leaf length and flower length. And so every dot represents a different individual. So this individual down here would have a short leaf and a short flower. Long leaf, long flower. And you can see there's some correlation here. If you have long flowers, by and large, you're also going to have long leaves, and vice versa. So we can probably see some sort of a correlation here. But then we're going to add a third component. So the question is, which of these individuals has the highest fitness? Now, if it didn't really matter how long your leaves were or how long your flowers are, then when we graph fitness in a third dimension, so now imagine that this one down here is your x-axis, this is your y-axis, and then we're going to add a z-axis, so we're going to make it three-dimensional. And on that z-axis, we're going to plot fitness. So we could measure, maybe do some observations, maybe do some sort of experimentation to measure the fitness of individuals based on the combination of these two traits. So, if everyone was the same, then basically we'd see like a tabletop, right, with no fitness levels. However, if there was a cluster around the middle, if it was best to be in the middle, kind of medium flower length and medium leaf length, then we might see something like, I'm going to hide, let's get rid of this one for now. So we'll do animations, delete. Okay. So we might see something like this on the left where the middle is best. And if you're an extreme in the flower or the leaf or any combination of those two things, then you're going to have low fitness. And so this would represent a fairly stable environment with natural selection selecting for the average, which would represent the best. And so we would expect to see most of the population clustered around that average with maybe a bit of genetic diversity still along the outside. Now, if there were other combinations, we might have other fitness peaks, right, where it's good to be here or here, not quite as good as the best combination. So we'd still have the population clustered around the best one. But this is a little bit more of a complex adaptive landscape, okay? And so I want to talk about what the three major forces of evolution would do to a population given these adaptive landscapes. So natural selection, by definition, is going to try and increase the fitness of populations. Individuals that are out here don't do well, they don't pass on their genes very much, and so we don't see those combination of traits as often. And so natural selection tends to push a population towards the peak of whatever slope they are on. So here we see the end. In this case, it's the best one, but if the population had been over here, then they would be pushed up to the top here. Genetic drift tends to spread the population out. And if it's a large population, genetic drift isn't a major force, and so the spread is only a little bit. And then, of course, mutation, the third evolutionary force, would randomly move individuals across this. If we get a brand new mutation with a new, super huge leaf, it would bounce it over here to where leaf length is really, really long. And in this case, that wouldn't be good. That individual wouldn't do well, and so we'd eventually see the population kind of, maybe if they had a few babies, they would either die out or they might do all right and evolve and mate with other individuals, and eventually we'd see clustering back here. Okay. So remember those three forces. Number one, natural selection moves you to the local peak. Genetic drift spreads you out a little bit. And then finally, a new mutation would randomly move you to a new place in this adaptive landscape. Now, this is only two traits, right? So start thinking about, what if we wanted to do three traits and then fitness? We would need 4 dimensions to show that. Now, our minds don't really visualize 4 dimensions well, but we can do this mathematically. We can do 5-dimensional, 6-dimensional. We can do multi-dimensional graphs. It's just hard to visualize them. So even though most adaptive landscapes and the only ones we're going to look at are just 2 traits with fitness on the third axis, we really could do as many axes as we needed to represent all of the traits that we were evaluating. Okay, so that's an adaptive landscape model, and they're very, very useful. Now, if environment changes, we might expect to see the topology of this change. So if it was really good to have medium flowers and medium leaves, but then some environmental thing changed, so it was really good to have medium flowers and long leaves, then we might see a shift in this direction. Or we could see a shift in a different direction if environment changed. And natural selection would then, if you ended up on a slope rather than a peak, natural selection would use the genetic diversity present in the population and different combinations and eventually get the population back to the peak as long as the change in the environment wasn't too extreme. And so there are some ramifications to this. So here we see a population, or at least an individual, that is stuck on a suboptimal peak. And so natural selection would tend to push them to this local fitness. We would need some genetic drift with some spread or some random mutation. And eventually we could then get individuals up to the global fitness maximum. Okay? But if these peaks are rather close to one another, then there might not be a huge difference. So large-scale phenotypic shifts can be caused by mutations. Genetic drift can cause spreading, and if it can get us across this adaptive valley, then it could get us onto a new peak also. And so it is possible to make large jumps, but it might take a long time. You know, that random mutation that moves you over might just as easily move you over to a bad spot. So it might take many hundreds or thousands of different random mutations before one individual ends up on one of these slopes, and the natural selection can work to create more individuals as they reproduce and mix with others and then move them to the top of the peak. So the end result is, if we have a very simple adaptive landscape, almost the entire population is going to look like themselves. So height in humans is kind of like this, maybe a little bit spread out, right? But most humans are somewhere between 4.5 and 6.5 feet tall. That's going to be probably 95% or so of all humans, with a very few on the outside. But if we're looking at other traits, so for instance, if we're looking at what sorts of behaviors do humans find attractive in a mate, we might see many different, nearly equally successful strategies. You can be funny, or you can be athletic, or you can be smart, and that's attractive to different individuals. And so for those sorts of traits, we might see a very complex adaptive landscape like this. And so think about diversity. If we're looking at an adaptive landscape like this, we'd have very low diversity for these traits that we are measuring. Whereas if we saw an adaptive landscape that was more like this one, this is like the Mount Fuji, this is like the Karakoram Mountains in the Himalayas, if you want to look that up. They're just very rugged like this, with many peaks being close to the same height. And an adaptive landscape like that maintains diversity in a population. And so diverse population for the traits we're examining under this one, less diverse here. And this is just simply a complex adaptive landscape mapped, almost like a relief map you'd see in geography. Okay? So different adaptive landscapes are going to have a very different impact. So think about that and think about what they would do to the population. All right, short and sweet. That's the end of adaptive landscapes. Next one, 3.1b, will be on quantitative trait loci analyses.